are ready. I will take the cup of and call on the name of the Lord. I will take the cup of salvation and call on the name of the Lord. How shall I make a return to the Lord for all the good He has done for me? The cup of salvation I will take up, and I will call upon the name of the Lord. I will take the cup of salvation and call on the name of the Lord. Precious in the eyes of the Lord is the death of His faithful ones. I am your servant, the son of your handmaid, and you have loosed my bonds. I will take the cup of salvation and call on the name of the Lord. To you will I offer sacrifice of thanksgiving, and I will call upon the name of the Lord. My vows to the Lord I will pay, and in the presence of all His people I will take the cup of salvation and call on the name of the Lord.
Okay, well, I want to welcome everyone here this morning. Thank you for joining us for this, our preaching and worship hour. Thank you to the ladies for the amazing music. And if you have any questions today of anything you hear in today's message, please reach out to Michael or myself. We even have some people who go around after the message, and if you have, you'll notice them, they'll be taking pictures. If you have a question, you can go to one of them, ask it, and we will answer it for you on video, and then we'll post that. So if you have questions, please make sure you get answers to those questions. It would just be a shame to leave a Christian church not having your questions answered. So reach out to us, and if there's anything else we can do for you, especially of a spiritual nature, if you need prayer or counsel, please let us know. That's what we're here for. That truly is the most important thing in our lives, is helping you in every way we can. By way of announcements today, first of all, I understand there was a terrific ladies' tea party here yesterday, and I've heard great reports from it from all sides. So congratulations, ladies. I'm glad that you had a great time. I hope it was a time of fellowship that renewed you and strengthened you for the things you do in life and ministry. There are also out, you know where the songbook rack is in the hallway out there, just sitting on the floor right next to that. There are some leftover, goodie bags and little things like that, some of the arts and crafts stuff. Please feel free to help yourself to that, especially if you know somebody else who wasn't here or could have been here, who would be blessed by those things. Please take some to them and make sure that gets distributed well and put to good purpose, especially for the gospel. I'm not aware of any other upcoming events or announcements at this time. Is there anything I'm missing? Then please give your attention now to the reading of the Word of God.
Is that okay? We'll be reading from the book of Matthew, chapter 18, verses 1 through 35. At the same time came the disciples unto Jesus, saying, Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus called a little child unto him, and set him in the midst of them, and said, Verily I say unto you, except ye be converted, and become as little children, you shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven. Whosoever therefore shall humble himself as this little child, the same is greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoso shall receive one such little child in my name, receiveth me. But whoso shall offend one of these little ones which believe in me, it were better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck, and that he were drowned in the depth of the sea. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come. But woe to the man by whom the offense cometh. Wherefore, if thy hand or thy foot offend thee, cut them off, and cast them from thee. It is better for thee to enter into life halt or maimed, rather than having 2 hands or 2 feet to be cast into everlasting fire. And if thine eye offend thee, pluck it out, and cast it from thee. It is better for thee to enter into life with 1 eye, rather than having 2 eyes to be cast into hellfire. Take heed that ye despise not one of these little ones. For I say unto you, that in heaven their angels do always behold the face of my Father, which is in heaven. For the Son of Man is come to save that which was lost. How think ye, if a man have 100 sheep, and one of them be gone astray, doth he not leave the 99, and goeth into the mountains, and seeketh that which is gone astray? And if so be that he find it, verily I say unto you, he rejoiceth more of that sheep than of the 99 which went not astray. Even so, it is not the will of your Father which is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish. Moreover, if thy brother shall trespass against thee, go and tell him his fault between thee and him alone. If he shall hear thee, thou hast gained a brother. But if he will not hear thee, then take with thee 1 or 2 more, that in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every word may be established. And if he shall neglect to hear them, tell it unto the church. But if he neglect to hear the church, let him be unto thee as a heathen man and a publican. Verily I say unto you, whatsoever ye shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever ye shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Again I say unto you, that if 2 of you shall agree on earth as touching anything that they shall ask, it shall be done for them of my Father which is in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them. Then came Peter to him and said, Lord, how oft shall my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? till 7 times? Jesus said unto him, I say not unto thee until 7 times, but until 70 times 7. Therefore is the kingdom of heaven likened unto a king, which would take account of his servants. And when he had begun to reckon, one was brought unto him, which owed him 10,000 talents. But forasmuch as he had not to pay, his Lord commanded him to be sold, and his wife, and children, and all that he had, and payment to be made. The servant therefore fell down and worshipped him, saying, Lord, have patience with me, I will pay thee all. Then the Lord of that servant was moved with compassion, and loosed him, and forgave him the debt. But the same servant went out, and found one of his fellow servants, which owed him 100 pence. And he laid hands on him, and took him by the throat, saying, Pay me that thou owest. And his fellow servant fell down at his feet, and besought him, saying, Have patience with me, I will pay thee all. And he would not, but went and cast him into prison till he should pay the debt. And when his fellow servants saw what was done, they were very sorry, and came and told unto their Lord all that was done. Then his Lord, after that he had called him, said unto him, O thou wicked servant, I forgave thee all that debt, because thou desiredst me. Shouldest not thou also have had compassion on thy fellow servant, even as I had pity on thee? And his Lord was wroth, and delivered him to the tormentors, till he should pay all that was due unto him. So likewise shall my heavenly Father do also unto you, if you from your hearts forgive not every one his brother their trespasses. This is the word of the Lord.
So today we're going to be discussing forgiveness. Forgiveness is perhaps the most unique doctrine in Christianity. Maybe certainly in the top 5, but it is unique in Christianity. If you read the Old Testament, you will find no mention of forgiveness. I'm speaking of personal forgiveness between people. God forgives all the time in the Old Testament, undoubtedly. But people forgiving other people, being told, there is not a single command in the Old Testament for you to forgive somebody. There just isn't. There's one oblique reference where David in Psalm 50, where David talks about, where Solomon in Proverbs says that a multitude of sins can be covered. But he really isn't talking about what you and I think about forgiveness. He's more talking about what even the Greek philosophers thought about forgiveness, and that's more like excusing something. And it's coming more from a patronistic viewpoint. In other words, Aristotle, Plato taught that if you are a wise man, then you'll realize that most people aren't, and so you'll afford them leniency, tolerance, and you'll overlook their peccadillos. You'll overlook their faults. But it's more of excusing them. It's not forgiveness. And they also believed that the wise man didn't need to have any thought or doctrine on forgiveness, because a wise man would never need it. They would never do anything that would require it. And so they would give it to the poor, unwashed masses because they just had such pity on them. That was the Greek mentality of it. And the Old Testament seems to kind of lean that way in Proverbs if you look at it. But that's like about the only reference there is to it. Old Testament just doesn't talk about this. And they believed, and David, in fact, in Psalm 51, really spells it out in ways that has kind of confused Christians for a long time, but David in Psalm 51 spells this all out. They believed that forgiveness was only from God. So the reason why there's not any talk in the Old Testament about forgiving one another is they didn't believe that you actually could forgive one another. Only God could forgive people. So David in Psalm 51 says, after he's done all that harm, he took Uriah's wife, he put him in the front of the battle so he did terrible things to someone else. David in Psalm 51 comes back and says, against you, God, only have I sinned. Now that to you and I just sounds very obtuse. I mean, very thick. How can you be so blind? Now, I'm not saying that's actually the case. I think David is making a very valid point, but I just want you to notice that in the Old Testament, the saints in the Old Testament did not think about forgiveness the way you and I think about it. It's not a technicality that the Pharisees are grasping at when they object to Jesus forgiving somebody. When they say only God can forgive sins, if you go back and read the Old Testament, you'll understand where they're coming from. Nobody forgives sins in the Old Testament, not even against themselves. I know we like to say, well, see, they believe you could forgive sins against yourself, just not forgive sins generally. That's not what they're saying. And the Pharisees were very much of the Old Testament mentality that the only one who could forgive any sins, all sin was against God. You didn't go ask someone, hey, forgive me. That's just not how it worked in that society, as far as we can tell. And it's not how it worked in the ancient Greek society. It's not how it worked in Roman society. That just isn't how forgiveness worked. There's a secular philosopher by the name of Charles Griswold. He wrote a very interesting book on this subject called Forgiveness, a Philosophical Exploration. Very large academic book where he goes through, and the first part of the book is he shows how forgiveness was understood across the world before and after Christianity. And he acknowledges, he's not a Christian, but he acknowledges that the Christian view of forgiveness is absolutely unique in the world. There is no other religion that has this view. There's no society that has had it. It is entirely unique to Christianity. He explains the way the Greeks thought of it. He, of course, goes through Friedrich Nietzsche's view. He's a German. You don't know who he is. He's a very famous German philosopher. Nietzsche despised Christianity. Really did despise it. Nietzsche believed that Christianity was what he called slave morality. It was the religion of the weak, and that Christianity had inverted the game. They had taken the game which should have been a game of power, of might, of overcoming, of being dominant, and they had flipped it upside down, and they had made up down and down up. In other words, they had made weakness to be strength and strength to be weakness, and he just despised Christianity for this. And he believed that forgiveness was really the quintessential point where this had happened. Instead of being perfection being the virtue, Christians had made forgiveness the virtue, which is an admission of guilt and of sin and of weakness. So he just really had a real problem with that. In fact, he wrote a whole essay on it. I think it's called on morality or something of that nature. You can read it, and he's just very blunt on this, but he has this view. He believed that forgiveness in the Christian sense was incredibly manipulative. He believed that Christians invented it in order to get the upper hand over the pagans because they couldn't dominate them any other way. And so that's how Nietzsche looked at it. And finally he points to two very influential sermons by someone you've never heard of probably. He was an Anglican bishop by the name of Joseph Butler in the late and mid 1700s. And this Anglican bishop preached two sermons that are still to this day incredibly influential on how we think about forgiveness. And basically what Butler did there is he took and he explained forgiveness as being a sort of a form or a way of treating your own resentment towards somebody or your own bitterness. Now, that should resonate. You should understand then where we're getting these ideas from. Because that's how we think about forgiveness today. We forgive people so we don't have to be bitter against them. That's how we deal with our bitterness, we say. So if you're bitter, you need to forgive. So if you have a problem with somebody, you have resentment, you have bitterness, that's because you haven't forgiven them. Forgiveness is about dealing with your own sense of resentment and your own sense of bitterness. This all comes from Butler's sermons in the 1700s. It's where that really took root, and and I know we haven't read the sermons, most people haven't, but many of us, I suspect all of us really, are living in the atmosphere that those created. And Griswold takes those sermons and extrapolates them out. He doesn't agree with everything he says, but he does believe they're the beginning of the modern view of forgiveness, and he expands on that. And so Griswold comes out and he gives you 6 conditions where after looking at secular forgiveness, he doesn't looking at it from a biblical worldview. He's looking at it entirely as a secular virtue. And he says forgiveness in a secular worldview requires 6 conditions. In order for you to be forgiven, if you've done wrong, you'd have to meet 6 conditions. And so these are what he says. First, you would have to acknowledge that you are a responsible agent, or you acted knowingly. So if you want to be forgiven, the first thing you'd have to do is acknowledge that you acted knowingly. All right? So if I've done you wrong, let's put it this way. If I've done you wrong and you're going to forgive me, you're going to have to, the first thing you're probably going to require of me is that I acknowledge that I did it knowing. If I come and say, I didn't realize it, I wasn't intentional, you're going to be hesitant to forgive me. The second thing is, I'm going to have to repudiate what I did. I can't defend it. I have to say it was wrong. I wouldn't ever do it again. It's terrible. I have to repudiate whatever it is I did. The third thing is I'd have to express regret that I've injured you in any way. So I can't just, pretend it was nothing. I'd have to acknowledge that offended you, that hurt you, that took from you, that impoverished you, and I have to express I'm very sorry about how that has damaged you. The fourth thing is I'd have to commit myself to becoming the type of person who would no longer do such a thing. So if you think that I'm actually not committed to not doing it again, you're going to be hesitant to forgive me. Now, this should all sound exactly the way you may not. I know we don't go through a checklist, when someone wants to be forgiven or someone harms us. We don't go through this checklist and say, oh, these are the things. But this is what we're looking for. If you read what he says or you hear what he says, you're going to recognize in yourself, this is exactly what you're really looking for in somebody. Because if somebody keeps doing the same thing over and over and over, then you say, well, why would I forgive them? They have no commitment to change. So that's what he's saying. Fifth thing is, I have to show you that I understand from your perspective what the damage that was done to you is. So I have to be able to say, I understand. I can't be oblivious to how this has hurt you. I have to somehow be empathetic towards how you perceive the damage. So if you feel that I'm just saying I'm sorry because I just want to put the matter behind us, you'll be hesitant to forgive. You want to see some type of empathy that I get it from your point of view what's wrong. And the sixth thing is that I need to offer, and this is a really big one, I need to offer a narrative that accounts for how I came to do that wrong and how it does not express the totality of my person. Let me explain this a little in case that wasn't clear. But what it's saying is I have to offer you some story, some narrative, some way of looking at me that says, even though I did that terrible thing and I acknowledge it was really bad and I'm real sorry about it, but that's not really who I am. So you can accept me because it's not really all of me. That's a part of me that I don't acknowledge as being I am a better person than that. And that's what we're looking for. If we really think that is the totality of the person, what they did to us, we're very hesitant to forgive. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to become worthy of acceptance. And that's how forgiveness is done in a secular view. And sadly, that's how forgiveness is done amongst Christians many times. I think this is actually far more normal than we might care to admit. And in our text, we see this same thing. So what is Peter's question on forgiveness? How many times do I have to forgive him? And in another place, it makes it clear what he's saying, because Jesus says if your brother does the exact same thing, 7 times a day he does the same thing, and 7 times a day he comes and says, I'm really sorry, forgive me, Jesus says forgive him. That's what they're objecting to. What do you mean? And don't pretend that you and I have not had this same dilemma. Yeah, we'll forgive the first time, the second time, but if 7 times in the same day I did the same thing, you're saying you would have no problem forgiving. It would be no problem. No, you would say, you know what? You're not worthy of forgiveness. You haven't met what? These criteria. This is a really good list of what we're looking at. I think if we want to understand how most of us generally look at forgiveness, Griswold gives us a really good insight. Now, he's not talking against that. I want to be very clear. To him, that is what forgiveness would require. But I think he's mistaken. And that is certainly not a biblical worldview. Now, as I said, he has no pretense of giving you a biblical worldview. This is a secular view of how forgiveness should work, but it's not a biblical view. It's a really good summary of this one. But forgiveness, as I said, is an incredibly unique Christian virtue. You know why there is any form of secular forgiveness? It's because of Christianity. There was, and he acknowledges this, and so does everyone else I've read. I've read a number of different Christian and secular writers and thinkers, philosophers over the last 3 weeks that we've been planning this message. I've read a ton of different ones on this, articles and books. Everyone acknowledges the same thing. There is no forgiveness outside of Christianity. It is the only intellectual framework that has that concept, the way you and I understand it. You can define it differently, and you come up with the Greeks in a little bit, you come up with the Hebrews a little bit, you come up with a secular worldview, but none of it, like the Christian view of it, there is just nothing like it. It is incredibly, incredibly unique. So now let's jump into the text a little bit, and we're going to go through this very quickly. I wanted to read the whole thing because I believe the whole portion that Marco read has to do with forgiveness. So I want you to notice. First, let me just break it down into a few big pieces. So Jesus first talks about offenses against the weak and the vulnerable. That's verses 2 through 7. And then he talks about owning that offense, owning up to it, acknowledging when you are the agent of the offense. That would be 7 and 9. He then talks about the reconciliation and restoration of the offensive. So whoever has committed the offense, how do we restore them? How do we reconcile them to us? That's what he talks about 10 to 15. And then he talks about repentance and rebuke of the unrepentant offenders. What do we do with someone who is offensive but they won't repent? How do we handle that? He talks about that. And then he talks about the forgiveness of those offenses towards the end of the chapter. And then he has a discussion on that with his disciples. That's how that section breaks down. But I want you to notice there's so much. This is something we really ought to look at and probably do like a 2 or 3 month series on forgiveness. It is such a huge and important topic. I'm not exaggerating when I'm telling you that this is the sine qua non of Christianity. The thing without which it does not exist. It is the single, I think, it could be arguable, but I believe it is probably the single most important doctrine as it pertains to us in Christianity. Very important we understand forgiveness. Okay, so I want you to understand why I say that, because I want to be very clear. I am making no pretense that I'm going to cover the whole of this topic. I am going to cover an extremely narrow sliver of it. Extremely narrow. So if you think, I think you left something out, let me just tell you right now, I'm leaving almost everything out. Okay? So you say, well, I think there's a lot more to be said. There is much, 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 much more to be said. I want to say that right now. So I want you to notice, let's just look at and notice 2 things about the text. The first thing I want you to notice is that Jesus never mentions forgiveness directly until he's asked about it. He never mentions forgiveness directly. This is very important because there is not just Nietzsche who despised Christianity because of their view of forgiveness, but actually the entire secular world continues to have the same contempt towards Christianity because they do. I know they don't identify. Nietzsche is very interesting to me because he's so honest and he actually identifies in himself what his problem really is with it, at least mostly. And that is he hated Christianity because it made him weak. I mean, that was his problem. Now, most people who have this hidden or veiled contempt for Christianity, they don't acknowledge what it really is. They pretend that it's that, God's unjust, or there's this problem of pain, or what about all the suffering? That really is all secondary or even tertiary. That is not their problem with Christianity. Because they don't have anything that doesn't have that problem. So when people say, well, the problem with Christianity is the problem of evil. Okay, fine, I get that. There's a real big problem there. It's like, how do we reconcile this? Fine. Okay, what intellectual system, which intellectual system doesn't have that problem? You can get rid of Christianity and you still have evil, and you still have to reconcile it to whatever it is you think and believe. Even Dawkins has said at times, very interestingly, that there are some points or parts of evolution that should not be taught to young children because of how brutal and horrible they are and how they're impossible to reconcile with suffering. So every system has to have the same problem. So when you point to Christianity and say, well, it has these problems, that's really not the reason people are rejecting Christianity. What they're rejecting about is what it says about them. Now, Nietzsche was very honest about that. But like I said, this is important to understand that Jesus doesn't jump into forgiveness. The complaint that many, especially secular people, but many Christians have with the Christian view of forgiveness is, well, what about the victims? It seems like it's just a doorway to abuse. And this is real big right now on social media. If you're especially, I don't know if any of you are on Twitter, but this is a big discussion on Twitter, has been for a while, and it's been a discussion for a very long time across Christendom. But here's the idea. Somebody can be let's just say a minister in a church. This is where most of this is radiating from, is from abuse by ministers. So you can have a pastor in a church, and he can abuse women sexually, and then when he gets caught, it's like, well, you should forgive him and put it behind us. And you're like, what about the victims? What about the abuse? How is this going to be confronted? And they're right. They're absolutely right. They're absolutely right. I don't want to in any way make it sound like I am defending those who take advantage, either financially or sexually or in any other way, taken advantage. Absolutely not. It is true. The Christian view of forgiveness, as it is commonly practiced, is incredibly deficient when it comes to offense and dealing with the offense. They are simpletons, they're naive, and they want to say we're just going to forgive and you just have to let it go and pretend it never happened. And if you bring it up, if you remember it, if you protect yourself against that person, it's because you haven't truly forgiven them. That is wrong. And it's not Jesus' view of forgiveness. Let's be very clear. Just because all the Christians practice this simple, naive form of supposed forgiveness, that isn't what Jesus says. So when you read Mark 18, I really would like for you to go home today and read this chapter again with these thoughts in mind. And look at how Jesus starts this conversation. He does not start this conversation saying, if you have bitterness in your heart, it's because you haven't forgiven. That is not how he starts this conversation. He starts the conversation saying, if you abuse a vulnerable person, it would be better if a millstone were tied around your neck and you were thrown into the ocean. If you got a Columbian baptism. That's what he's saying. It would be better for you than what's coming towards you. That's how Jesus begins this. We cannot talk about forgiveness without acknowledging that first and foremost we have to deal with the offense and the offenders, and we have to protect the vulnerable and the weak. Protecting people that need to be protected. That is not what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is not about allowing pedophiles and sexually abusive people and financially abusive people to stay in positions of power because they've been forgiven. That isn't forgiveness. Forgiveness isn't, well, he said he was sorry, so don't tell the authorities. Let me explain right now. So there's no confusion. Let me explain right now. If I find out that you have sexually abused a child, I'm calling the police. I don't care how much you repent. And I'm not saying I don't believe your repentance. I'm saying you're going to jail. Goes for everybody in this room. I don't care if you're the pastor. If it's me and I do it, you call the police. Forgiveness is not about getting out of the consequences of your actions. And that's where Jesus begins. Read the chapter. That's where he begins. And then he says, and you should own up to the offense. Forgiveness is not about getting out of acknowledging your fault. So he says, if you're the one who's offended, leave everything and go find the person you've done wrong to and try to make things right. Own up to what you've done. That's the second thing he deals with. And then he says, and we should be trying to restore those who have done wrong. So how do we do that? And he goes through some teaching on how we can restore those who've done wrong. And then what do we do with people who've done wrong and won't acknowledge it? Well, let's deal with that. So he deals with that and says, this is how we deal with it. You go talk to them. They won't listen to you, take some witnesses. If they won't listen to you, take them before the church. If they won't hear the church, kick them out. All he's done is deal with offense. Now, that's the one thing I want you to notice. So when he gets done saying all that, I want you to notice a second thing. The response, after hearing all of that about offense, is not self-righteousness, condemnation, sanctimoniousness. Is none of that. The first thing they say after they hear that whole discussion we just went through very briefly, in summary, is Peter saying, how often do I have to forgive? There is something about the person and the teaching of Jesus Christ that leads his disciples to a single conclusion every time. And this is not to mitigate or in any way to set aside everything I just said. It is not to say that, it is to say that, rather, that forgiveness does not stand in opposition to justice. It doesn't stand in opposition to righteousness. The complaint of liberal Christians and secular humanists that I've been reading on this, it always comes to the same thing. They're like, Christian forgiveness does away with social justice. It does away with moral justice. It's saying that if you were a slave trader, if you were a racist, if you were a bigot, if you're a homophobe, if you're this or if you're that, if you're a sexually abusive person, if you can be forgiven, and then we don't have to deal with any consequences of your actions. And they have a problem with forgiveness on that level. And they're right. They really are right, but that's not what Jesus taught. Jesus taught that forgiveness is the conclusion of justice. It's the conclusion of righteousness. It's not the opposition to it. It's not the opposite to it. It's not a dichotomy between either we forgive or we have justice. Jesus is saying we can have justice, and when he talks about justice, his disciples come to a single conclusion. Well, how much forgiveness are you talking about? Which is a very interesting conclusion because Jesus never said to forgive anybody. And yet his teaching, the way he presents this subject of justice, leads to an invariable conclusion of forgiveness. And forgiveness, therefore, is probably, once you understand what forgiveness is, from the way Jesus explains it, the way he understands it, forgiveness is probably the most offensive doctrine in the entire Bible. To paraphrase Woody Allen, we could say, is forgiveness offensive? Only when it's done right. Only when it's done right. If forgiveness is this wonderful concept that's so beautiful and just lovely, then you have not understood what Jesus taught. Because when Jesus taught about forgiveness and everything related to it, people got very upset and very confused. Think about Peter. He just got on talking about all this justice and righteousness and doing things right and correcting all the things that are wrong. And Peter comes and says, well, wait a minute. How often are you saying I have to forgive my brother? When Jesus teaches about it, when Jesus teaches about justice, we don't just come to the conclusion of forgiveness. We come to the conclusion of an inexhaustible, promiscuous forgiveness. An inexhaustible, promiscuous forgiveness. Peter says, and he went out on a limb here. You have to understand, Peter's coming from a culture who doesn't forgive anybody. Forgiveness isn't in their vocabulary. Okay? So then he really goes out on a limb and he says, well, how many times must I forgive my brother? 7? I mean, he thought he was really putting himself out there. And Jesus responds, no, 7 times 70. Now, if you're a pedant, then you're going to say, well, that's 490 times. But that's missing the point, right? So let me try to put it in modern language. Jesus says, no, not 7, to infinity and beyond. That's what 7 times 70 would mean in that culture. To infinity and beyond. How often should you forgive? That often. Then he tells a parable. We're still in the text. He tells a parable. It's probably the most terrifying parable he ever told. It really is terrifying. Most people, I got a stack of commentaries, and I don't mean the popular ones. I have academic commentaries, and practically everyone just skips right over this. They just don't want to deal with these things because it's terrifying and it's extremely hard to understand. But he tells a parable, and I don't pretend right now to try to commentate on or explicate the parable, but let's just look at it in some of its details. He tells a parable of 2 debtors. One owes 10,000 talents, right, and one owes 100 pence. So let me try to translate that. There's several ways that we could put that into context so you can understand what our 10 things. Because if you've ever been to a foreign country and they give you a handful of money and you just go to the vendors and say, and they go, how much is it? And they go, and you just hold out your money and they, because you don't know what money is worth there. That's kind of how you feel when you read the New Testament. They put these, 10,000 talents. You're like, oh, I don't know how much that is. So let me try to put that into context. There's a couple ways we could put it into context. One way is to say, okay, how many days would you have to work to earn 10,000 pounds, 10,000 talents? And that works out to about 10,000. Looking at it as day labor, works out to about $5 billion in today's money, $5 billion. There's another way of looking at it, and that is in a portion of GDP, which is actually probably a better way of conceptualizing it. Like how much percentage of the Roman Empire's GDP would 10,000 talents be? And if we look at it as a portion of GDP and compare it to our GDP in America, then that man owed about $2.3 trillion. 2.3 trillion. Huge debt. Either way you look at this is a massive debt that no one could ever possibly repay. That's Jesus' point. Another way of looking at it is that the word 10,000, the number 10,000, that was the biggest number that the Greeks had a single word for. So once you went above that, they do like we do. You start adding other words to it, like 13, 14. That's what they did. 101. So they had an actual name, a word for the number 10,000. So that was like they would use then that 10,000 just became idiom for the maximum amount, an insane amount of money. So we would say in today he owed $1 gazillion. $1 gazillion, because that's the biggest number we have a name for. $1 gazillion. You can't have a bigger than $1 gazillion. That is, by definition, the biggest. And the other man owed 100 pence, which is basically 100 days' wages, so he owed roughly $5,000. So that's the disparity between the two men. One owes, let's say, just be generous to him, right? Make it easy on him and say he only owes $5 billion, not 2.3 trillion, not 10% of the Roman Empire's yearly GDP. And the other man owes 5,000. But it's a significant debt, and that's important in the parable. Jesus isn't saying, hey, that's nothing. It's something. It's significant. It's 100 days' work. He owes a significant amount, but, relatively speaking, his debt was infinitesimally smaller than the other. So that's the parable. And the parable, of course, it is very clear. You've heard it, but the one that's for the king forgives the massive debt that no one could ever possibly repay. He just forgives it. He doesn't take any family members and imprison them. He doesn't sell anyone into slavery. He doesn't even ask for a promise to never do it again. He just forgives it. And when the man walks out, he sees the other servant who owes a significant amount, but in comparison to his own debt was just forgiven, infinitesimally less. And starts to choke him and beat him and tells him he's going to put him in prison and all his family until he pays the debt. When the king hears about that, he calls him back in and says, I forgave you and you couldn't forgive, and he revokes his forgiveness and sells him off into slavery. Now we have no time here to try to even delve into what that could all mean. But just notice how serious Jesus is about forgiveness. This is what I want you to notice this morning. I know you may have a lot of questions, how that relates to salvation and eternal security and a lot of things, and I get it, but let's just set those aside for the moment. And just look at, I think, the single most important point that Jesus is trying. He is using a great deal of hyperbole. Nobody in the entire Roman Empire ever owed that much money. This is hyperbole, a lot of it. He's doing that for effect. He wants you to understand just how serious he is about this point on forgiveness. He is very serious. Very serious. In fact, he says we should pray when he taught us to pray. Our prayer should include, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And then he says at the end of this, if you will not forgive your brothers, God will not forgive you. Now, that is something we need to look at in more detail. It means more than what meets the eye. But just for the moment, just look at it in a broad, like a bird's eye view, and realize that Jesus is saying forgiveness is not unimportant. It is incredibly important. Okay, so that's the text. So now let's try to conclude this and wrap this up. I know I'm about out of time, so let's wrap this up a little bit on this text and what Jesus is saying here. One of the things, of the many, many things, and that is we are dealing with what the cost of forgiveness is. What is the cost of forgiveness? Why is forgiveness so critical, so important to Jesus? Because forgiveness bears an enormous cost. Just take the parable, for example. The king forgives $5 billion. Forgiveness is not a magical thing that makes everything that was damaged or lost or stolen reappear. If I steal $1,000 from you and come to you and say, I stole $1,000 from you, I'm really sorry. It grieves me. I don't have any money. I can't repay it. I've spent it. And you forgive me. You are absorbing that debt. Do you understand that? You are absorbing that debt. You're paying it. When somebody wrongs you morally, ethically, when they hurt your feelings even, and you forgive it, you are saying, I will absorb the debt. I'll pay it. You don't have to pay it. I'll pay it. That's the cost. Now, this is the difference in Christian forgiveness and all other quasi or pseudo forgivenesses there are around outside of Christianity. Especially secular forgiveness. Secular forgiveness is all about your feelings as the victim. Your bitterness, your resentment. Christian forgiveness is not about that. That is because they don't see sin as a real thing. Sin is just a construct. But in the biblical worldview, sin is real. It's real. And it's not just something that instantiates when you act. It's actually a principle that is at work in the world like a dark force of evil. Paul says that you can become enslaved to sin. Jesus said the same thing. You can become enslaved to sin. It's like a dark, evil master over the entire universe. That when Adam sinned, when Adam disobeyed God, sin entered into the world and it took over the world like this dark, evil force, and that's what we are battling against. When you think, well, why can't I ever overcome my sin? Why am I so weak? You have to understand, you are not just battling against some habit in your mind. You are doing battle against a massively, it's like, why can't you just float in the air? The reason you can't float in the air isn't because you're a couple pounds overweight. It's because there is a universal principle of gravity that you are fighting against. That's what sin's like. It is a universal principle of evil all through the universe, through and through, everywhere. It has infiltrated everything. Christians believe sin is real. And Christians believe that forgiveness truly deals with that sin. So the idea that you forgive someone to not be bitter, in my opinion, as I read the scriptures, is absolutely insane. That is a silly, silly view of forgiveness. Will forgiving someone take away your bitterness? No. Will it make you feel better towards them? No. No. There are other ways to deal. I'm not telling you that those things shouldn't be dealt with. There are other things that deal with that. So if I forgive someone and I still feel bitter, does that mean I didn't forgive them? From a Christian worldview, the answer is no. It does not mean that. Forgiveness is a legal maneuver, a legal action. I am legally absolving you of guilt, and it doesn't matter how I feel about it. I can be angry and bitter and resentful and never look at you again and never want to talk to you again and never want to see you again. And it does not change that you were forgiven. Because what's bound on earth is bound in heaven. That's what Jesus says in the text. What we bind and what we loose is true. It actually happens. It happens outside of your feelings, outside of your emotions. It actually gets put down, let's just say it metaphorically, but it gets written down in God's cosmic accounts. So forgiveness is not a win-win. It is a lose-win situation. Somebody has to lose. That's the uniqueness about Christianity. So let me summarize this and try to wrap this up now on this conclusion. There is one thing that most closely links to forgiveness in the Bible, and that's the cross. What I am telling you today is that when you forgive, or when you're asked to forgive, when you should forgive, what we are actually saying, what Jesus is actually telling you, is that you need to climb up on the cross and die for that person. That's what he's saying. You remember all the times Jesus says, take up your cross, and we want to think, oh, that sounds really impressive, but I don't know what it means exactly. It means a lot of things, but overall, more than anything else, I would tell you that taking up your cross means this: forgiving someone. Because that's what you're doing when you forgive. What did Jesus do when he forgave you? He took up his cross. There is no forgiveness without the cross. That's what it is. There's this great conversation between Jesus, James, and John. They want to be on the right and the left hand of the Father, of the Lord and his kingdom, right? When you're in your kingdom, when you're in your glory, we want to be on your right and left hand. And Jesus looks at them and says, you don't understand what you're asking, but do you think you could do it? Do you think you could drink my cup? Do you think you could do that? And they go, yes, we could. He goes, one day you will. But right now, it's already been assigned. And Christians for a long time have been pontificating over who gets to be on the left and the right, because we don't understand what this is about. N.T. Wright has explained this in a way that I've thought about it for a long time, and I've come to think that he is dead on accurate on this. What he explains is that Christ's throne that they were wanting to sit on the right and the left of, that was his cross. And the ones that it was assigned to are the two thieves on the left and the right. They didn't understand what they were asking. Christians want to be like Jesus. Christians want to have him share his glory with them. And that's wonderful. That's a great ambition. But do you understand what you're asking? Do you understand what the glory and the throne of Christ is? It's the cross. It's the crown of thorns. Like Newbigin said, our King reigns from the tree. It's a throne of wood, not of gold. You're called to be like Christ. And what do you think that means? What do you think that means? Now let me ask you this. How often do you have opportunity to be like Christ? I mean, really, be realistic. How often do you and I, in our very comfortable, easy life, really have the opportunity to do like what Paul said, to fulfill in ourselves what's lacking of the suffering of Christ? How often do you really have a chance to do that? Not very often, right? We're very blessed. We should be very thankful. But how often? Not very often. But I want to submit to you that there are opportunities in your life all around you every day to be like Christ, to take up his cross, to suffer with him, to fulfill in yourself what's lacking of his suffering. Every day there are opportunities. There are crosses all around you. And you're saying, I want to be like Christ. I want to share in his glory. I want to rejoice in the glory of God. And Jesus is saying, come on up. Come on up. All around you there are crosses. Just climb right up on one. How do we do that? We forgive. We forgive. And when we do, we are crucifying ourselves. We're bearing the cost. We're paying the price for another. Just as Jesus did it writ large for us. Well, we'll end there. We're way over time. There's a lot more to be said. We'll get back to this in a future date. We are going to get back to this. We're going to go through more about forgiveness. I think it's an incredibly important thing that Christians understand. It's what defines or certainly differentiates Christians from all other faith, all other belief systems. So maybe we should all really put some thought into this. I invite you to read through Matthew 18 more carefully, analyze it, and we'll get back and talk about it more. But let's close with prayer. Father in heaven, I thank you from the bottom of my heart, deeply, deeply grateful that for the comfort and for the prosperity and just for all the blessings you've bestowed on me. So I just have no words for it. But Father, I do also deeply want to be like you. Father, I do want to be like my Lord. I'm not more worthy than him. So help me, Father, to find these crosses in my life that I can fill, that I can validate through a self-sacrifice. Father, I ask that I would be more forgiving, that I would look at the massive debt I owed, the incredible forgiveness you gave me, bought, purchased by your sacrifice and your blood, and that I would then be more like you, and I would be promiscuous in my forgiveness. That I would forgive as often as you allow me opportunity to do so. I ask that you would also impress us upon the minds and the hearts of all those here today. Help us in this church to be a forgiving people. And in the name of Jesus, our example, our Lord, our forerunner, I ask these things. If anyone has any questions, I'll be up here in front for a little while. I'll be happy to try to clarify or explain, or maybe you just want to share something with me on it. I really would like to hear it.